ever struggle with forgiveness? I mean, like, somebody does something to you, and you know you're supposed to forgive, but forgiving them is kind of a struggle, right? Or somebody blames you for something, and they're upset with you, and you don't understand why they won't forgive you. In fact, you struggle to understand why they should have to forgive you at all. I mean, what did you do? It's not your fault. Right? Or do you struggle with the idea of unforgiveness? Like, I just don't know what to do if someone won't forgive me. And I think if I'm honest with myself, that the hardest version of forgiveness or unforgiveness for me is when I blame myself. And there's things that I carry, that I've done, that I cannot undo, that I can never fix. And I think when we find ourselves in that place, we can start to be in a position where it's hard to even think of forgiveness. Maybe even struggle to believe that Jesus could forgive us. Right? Because there's a lot of sides to forgiveness, right? Extending forgiveness is hard. Honestly, asking for forgiveness is really hard. Right? And then even when we receive it, depending on what we've done, it can be really hard to accept it. So with all that in mind, what I wanted to do today was continue the series we've been in, saying it's okay to be a work in progress. In other words, it's okay to struggle. It's okay not to know what to do. It's okay to not be sure of how to deal with things, because we're all just figuring it out anyway. And what I want to look at today is this idea of forgiveness. And I want to look specifically at the idea of faith and forgiveness. Going to continue the stuff we started talking about beforehand. Because forgiveness is a big topic, and at some point we'll do a whole series on kind of all the different aspects of forgiveness and kind of processing all that. But what I want to really focus on today is something that, I don't know that we grasp as, I think, wonderfully as we should. Is that in Jesus, there is a freedom found in his forgiveness. That whatever you are carrying, whatever you have done, even those things you can't fix, the damage that will be forever, there's a forgiveness available in Jesus. Through faith in Jesus. And then this idea of, I kind of keep beating this drum today, but it's not about being good enough for God. In fact, what Paul tells us is that's a waste of time. And this won't sound like encouragement, but it's meant to be. You can never be good enough for God. I can never be good enough for God. Right? Because we keep doing things that hurt people. Because what did we know? What is sin? Right? Sin is anything we do that hurts ourselves or hurts someone else. That includes how we treat people, how we think about people, the things that we could do and don't do, as well as the things that we do. So there's a freedom in that don't even try. But instead, embrace the freedom of Jesus' forgiveness, and then embrace the life that leads us to. And through the power of God's Holy Spirit, right? We kind of have these banners up here. Come, Holy Spirit. Like, what does that mean, right? That means that as we put our faith in Jesus, that the very Spirit of God will dwell within us and direct our souls and strengthen us to do more than we can, to resist things that maybe we couldn't resist before, to treat people differently than we used to treat them. But that's what's extended to us. As we talk about salvation, I think I've mentioned this before, that I grew up in a church where salvation was a get-out-of-hell-free card, right? It was like, just, when you die, you don't go to hell. That's all I'm hoping for. And I am hoping for that. Actually, I'm not hoping for that. I'm actually confident in that, right? But life here changes too. And that's what is extended to us. But I think a lot of us struggle with that idea. The idea of, how is putting faith in Jesus, how does that change anything? And I think another idea that we often struggle with is that, maybe that person needs Jesus, but I'm okay, I'm good enough. I've been going to church every Sunday for 75 years. That's the entry fee, right? Like, you get a punch card, and if you punch your church card enough times, they got to let you in no matter what you did. Right? That's why Peter's at the gate, by the way. He's not at the gate, just But, these are real struggles, right? That there are struggles on both sides. I talk to people who believe that there is no path for them, that God will never forgive them. And honestly, I talk to people who think they're all set because of what they've done. Not because of faith in Jesus, because you have faith in Jesus, you are all set. Right? But it's more than just all set. Are we living in that life? Are we living in all that means? But we all need that. We all need that. But as we talked about throughout this series, that one of the things that I find so amazing is that human behavior doesn't change much. Right? The same sort of struggles that we have now were the same sort of struggles that people in the first century had. So kind of whatever we're wrestling with, there is a first century narrative that can probably kind of match up with what we're struggling with. Right? So throughout this series, what we're doing is looking at a number of different gospel accounts that actually, I think, parallel to the things that we're talking about. And today is a bit of this idea of Jesus' forgiveness and do we need it and a response to it. Now, the folks we'll talk about today, it's kind of interesting. We're actually going to actually follow Jesus to a dinner that he's been invited to. He's going to have an encounter with two people. And these two people will be part of this encounter, but their experience is very different from one another. And their attitude is incredibly different from one another. And I think what we see here, this is kind of my assessment of it, is that one of the folks understands that they are on a journey. And that through Jesus they find a path forward. The other person doesn't seem to think they're on a journey. In fact, they kind of seem to think they've arrived. They've got it sorted out. Okay, so let's jump into it. So this actually comes to us from the gospel author Luke. And just to clarify, whenever I talk about the gospel, right, the gospel is simply right. One of the books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, there's four books that give us an account of Jesus' life. Right? And so Luke's book is kind of interesting because Luke was a researcher. Right? Technically, he was a doctor, but he actually, under the guidance of some guy named Theophilus, we think Theophilus could have paid for Luke to do the work. And Luke spent years researching what had happened in the life of Jesus. And so Luke gives us kind of really complete account of the things that happened. So Jesus is invited to dinner by this Pharisee named Simon. Now, the Pharisees show up a lot in the New Testament. New Testament, there's only one. The New Testament. And Pharisees are kind of interesting, right? Because Pharisees were the kind of most religious among that first century Jewish crowd. They were generally deeply educated. They tended to live better than most people because they had access to more resources. And they were the ones who kind of told other people how they were supposed to live. Right? Because what had happened was that Jesus had God had actually delivered through Moses this kind of the initial law, right? From the Old Testament law, or sometimes it's called the law. And what God had handed down through Moses was this kind of guidance for how to live a life that's more full, more complete, healthier, all these sort of things. But as time went on, the religious leadership kept layering things on top of that. They started kind of making up rules, and they started kind of creating traditions. And somehow these traditions stopped being traditions, and they said, those are laws too. And they're all from God, and you have to do all of them. But it became so complicated that no one was really clear what they could or could not do in many cases. Only the Pharisees understood. So if you had a question, you had to go see a Pharisee, and he'd tell you if you were okay or not. And then Jesus comes along. And Jesus lives completely according to God's law, without fail. But he has no regard for all the things the Pharisees, the religious leadership, have layered on top of that basic sort of guidance from God. And that kind of upsets them. Because they have this kind of struggle, because in their minds, if you don't do things the way we think you should do them, then you can't be of God. But he kept doing this pesky thing like healing people, or just kind of interpreting scriptures with incredible clarity, and as they were talking about, with incredible authority. So the Pharisees were always trying to figure him out. And one of the things that they would commonly do is they would try to draw him into debates. And they would try to set traps for him, like word traps, like try to put him in a situation where there was no way to win the argument. And so odds are, when Simon invites Jesus over to his house for dinner, to Simon's house for dinner, that's probably the intent. You know, the most positive view of it is that he just wanted to talk to Jesus to get a better understanding of Jesus. The most likely view is it was kind of part of this exercise. We're going to try and trip him up and see what he does with that and see where it goes from there. Now, as Jesus goes over to Simon's house, if we were in the room as Jesus arrives and we were familiar with first century Jewish culture, we would notice some things that don't happen when Jesus arrives. Because normally what you would do in that culture, there were certain courtesies that you would extend to a guest. Just going a sign of respect. So normally when a guest would come by your house, one of the things you would do is you would greet them with a kiss on the cheek, just kind of a standard greeting. Other issues are related to what life is like, you know, in the Middle East. Right? It's dry, it's sandy, you know, it's hot, and people are wearing sandals. So one of the courtesies you would extend is the opportunity for a person to get there and just kind of rinse their feet off, just kind of freshen up a little bit. Or you might extend oils because the air is so dry, just put a little oil on just to kind of freshen up. And this would be standard courtesy for a respected guest. None of those things happen. He simply invites Jesus in and to go join the other guests that are there at the table. And so the narrative tells us that when Jesus goes over there, he does what's called reclining at the table. And I think we've talked about this before, but just kind of as a refresher, reclining at the table relates to the fact that when they were gathering for a meal, they did not sit in chairs. They either lied on pillows or like couches. And so what you would do is you would basically kind of, they would be arranged at an angle. So like the table's here, and there'd be like an angle, and you would kind of lean on one side, and you'd kind of reach forward to eat. And you would, yeah, it's kind of odd, right? Yeah, yeah. I think they wanted to see if anybody would do it, and they kept doing it, so they just didn't stop, yeah. And what happens is the guests would actually be kind of arranged around the table. And that's really important for the next part of the story. But the thing that's kind of interesting is that this narrative talks a bit about a woman kind of putting things on Jesus' feet. And we talked about a different narrative back at Palm Sunday. And the reason it's kind of important to understand how they fit is that if you're sitting in a chair and somebody starts doing something to your feet, they tend to be in a really awkward spot, right? But if you're laying on a sofa or a pillows and your feet are straight behind you, it's very easy for someone to get access to your feet. Odd picture, but simply the way it is. And so as they're gathered there around the table, the narrative tells us this. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came in with an alabaster jar of perfume. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. That, say a group of us get together for a dinner, whether we're laying down or sitting at the table, and someone that we have not invited comes walking into the room. Would you consider that strange? Interestingly, they did not. Because we need to understand a little bit about the Pharisees. The Pharisees like to show off. They are far more educated than most people they encounter. They love to debate. So what they would do in these situations is people in town could come to be spectators to see their brilliance and their wisdom. And they would often then try to outdo each other. So the idea is that they actually like the idea of an audience. So it would not be unusual for people from town to come in and watch this dinner. But there was also another tradition that, remembering that Pharisees also tended to have many more resources than average people. They would have access to lots of food. It might be a larger amount of food. It might be food you don't commonly have access to. And so one of the other traditions was that when the meal was over, the poor could collect the leftovers and take it with them. So in this kind of a situation, if this woman comes walking in, is she a spectator? Or is she just someone here, she wants to get here early so she can kind of get first shot at the leftovers? But whatever the case, the other folks there at the meal would not have thought it unusual for someone like her to come in. But they probably had an opinion about her. Because we don't know her name. We don't know what she does. She's simply identified as having lived a sinful life. And what I want to kind of say to all of us, and please know I say this without condemnation, I'll say it about me first. I have led a sinful life. I continue to sin in my life. Hopefully not willfully anymore, but for a long time I did. Right? And the reality is that we all lead a sinful life. We all don't treat people as well as we should. We all are not as patient as we should be. We all don't make the difference that we could in the world. Don't say that condemnation is simply a factor of truth, that none of us live up to the standard that Jesus sets. But instantly, this woman's life had reached a point that her identity is, at least to those around her, that she has led a sinful life. And what I find kind of interesting here is kind of there's an interesting transition that happens in the narrative. Remember I said that the fact that she came in and was watching, she was there, that would not have seemed unusual to them at all, to the people at the table. But the next thing she does is unusual and is uncomfortable. In fact, it is just as uncomfortable to them as it would be to us. Because remember, she bought this perfume with her, and it's a very, very expensive perfume. Something that you wouldn't expect an everyday person to have access to. And it says, as she stood behind Jesus at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. And then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and then poured perfume on them. That is as awkward to them as it would be if it happened in your house. But what's happening here? Right? I think that much of what's happening in this moment is not what she had planned. That she's overflowing with emotion, that she did want to take this perfume and pour it onto Jesus' feet. Because remember, his feet are kind of sticking out behind him because he's on these sofas or pillows. And I think as she got there, the emotion of being so close to him, understanding who he is and what it means, because emotions just start to pour out of her as tears. And I always picture her as she's there crying, and she realizes that she's crying onto him, and that's not what she meant to do. And so she just takes her hair to just try to clean that up. That she just is so overwhelming. And I think that as she kisses his feet, I think it's just, she's in the moment, recognizing that she is standing next to the Son of God. And it just overflows from her. It was never what she intended to do. But then she does do what she did intend to do, was to pour the perfume on his feet. And I look at that. And she basically said, I don't have much, but all I have is yours. This is probably the most valuable thing that she owned. And Lord, because of what you've given to me, I just want to give you all I have. And we see that in her emotions. We see that in her actions. I just want to give that to you. Now, we don't know what is happening in her life, what she is going through. A lot of people speculate about what she did for a living. None of that's important, and it's all speculation. Just as we said, she's known as having lived a sinful life, and whatever she has been through is weighing on her. And we know that she was looked down on. The label she has as sinful woman. That's the label. The thing is, she knows who Jesus is. And she knows what he can do. And she knows that Jesus provides a path to forgiveness, a path to freedom, freedom from all that we've been through. And to be clear, none of what she is doing is intended to earn that forgiveness. She's not even trying to do that. What she's done is she's already accepted that forgiveness and embraces it. And she's expressing her gratitude for the forgiveness that it brings and what that means in her life. Now, what's interesting is that we see this woman with this overwhelming emotion for Jesus and her love for Jesus and recognizing that all that he has done for her in forgiving her. But then we look at Simon. Remember Simon? Remember Simon in the story? Right, the Pharisee who invited Jesus over. Right? Simon seems to have a very different attitude about what's going on. What we see in Simon is judgmentalism. He's judging this woman for her life. And interestingly, he also is judging Jesus. Because the narrative tells us. It says that when the Pharisee who invited Jesus, in other words, Simon, right, saw this, Simon said to himself, If this man were a prophet, he would know he's touching him and what kind of woman she is. He would know that she is a sinner. In other words, she's a broken person, a person that good people stay away from. And Jesus isn't staying away from her. In fact, not only is he not staying away from her, she's doing this to him, and he's not even stopping her. Good people don't do that. Good people don't put up with that behavior. So Jesus can't be a good people, because good people don't do that. And he's also calling into question, is Jesus really from God? Because he says if this man were a prophet, in other words, if he's really from God, he'd know these things. And if he's of God, he would know what was going on in her heart and what was happening with her. And the thing to kind of ask ourselves, do we ever struggle with being like Simon? How we look at other people? And do we judge them? And some of the darkest things I think we do sometimes is that we look at ourselves. And do we sometimes judge ourselves? Do we look at ourselves and all that we've done and what it means? And do we believe that there is a freedom from that? Because I think if we look at ourselves, there are two extremes in how we might look at ourselves. There's another option, too, we'll get to in a minute. But there are two extremes in how we can look at ourselves. One extreme is we can look at ourselves and we can kind of be Simon on ourselves, right? Saying that I've done things that I can't undo, right? That I can't be forgiven for. In fact, I'm not sure that Jesus would even forgive me for this. That I've just done too much to get past that. But there's another category that I would say is just as bad, if not worse. People like the Simons of the world. Because what's Simon's attitude? If there's a problem, I'm good. Right? I've got everything covered. I mean, yeah, I'm not perfect, but I'm not like those people. I'm not like her, and I'm not like him. Yeah, we think that we've got it all good enough. That God has to let me in because I have my card punched. I've done all the right things. And the thing is that neither of those is the answer. None of us are so far gone that we can't be forgiven. And none of us are so good that we don't need to be forgiven. That is the core of the gospel. That there is forgiveness available, and we all need it. We simply have to ask for it. Now, what's really kind of interesting to me, as Simon is looking at Jesus, and he says, basically, he can't be a prophet because he would know what was going on in that woman's heart, right? That's kind of the point that he's saying. Well, Jesus kind of does something really interesting, super easy to miss. So as Simon says this to himself, not out loud, that this man can't be a prophet because he would know what was in her heart. Notice what the next thing says. Jesus answered him. In other words, Jesus knew exactly what was going on in Simon's heart. Simon never said it out loud, but Jesus knew what he was thinking. So maybe he could be of God after all. And so Jesus says, Simon, I have something to tell you. And Simon says, well, go ahead, teacher. Another easy thing to miss. That is sarcastic. Right? Now, Jesus was known as a teacher or a rabbi. They use either term. Right? But he's basically like, okay, Simon's like, okay, Jesus, you know so much. Go ahead and tell me something. What do you got that I need? I don't think you got anything that I need. And then Jesus does what he often does in situations like this. He tells a parable. Remember, a parable is simply a fictional story told to make a point. So Jesus goes on to say, two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. So now, denarii is a measure of 1 day's wages. So one person owed 500 days' wages, or we'll call it a year and a half wages. The other person owed 50 days' wages. We'll call it a month and a half of wages. And the thing that's important to remember is that for most people at that time frame, they lived a subsistence life. Right? Subsistence means you get up, You work enough at that today to make enough today to get through today, to go to bed, wake up again tomorrow, to do enough today, to make enough today, to get through today. So you're 50 days behind, 500 days behind. It'd be like if I said to you, you owe $10 million. You'd go, 10 million, 100 million, why don't you make it $1 billion? It doesn't matter, I can't pay it anyway. And Jesus goes on to make that point. Neither of the men had the money to pay the moneylender back, so he forgave the debts of both. Both had a debt they could not pay. One clearly owed much more, but they still owed it. But it was forgiven in either case. And then Jesus gets to his point. Now, which of them loved him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who has a bigger debt forgiven. Jesus is like, you have judged correctly. Why is Jesus telling this parable? Nobody owes any money here. His point is that they both had a debt. Simon had a debt, and this woman had a debt. A debt that neither could pay on their own. But the woman's behavior, her love for Jesus, shows that she understands. That Jesus is saying that there is some relationship between love and forgiveness. Right? That God does not love us because we're forgiven. Right? He doesn't forgive us because we love him. We love him in response to his forgiveness. Right? That when we realize how much we have been forgiven of and how much we need it, and we all need it, that love is expressed in action, expressed by what we do. And so what Jesus paints as he kind of finishes up kind of the narrative here is the picture between what this woman understands and what Simon understands. As Jesus says, okay, that basically when you understand what you've been given, that's expressed with love. And love leads to action. So he compares the actions of the woman and Simon. Remember that Simon did not even do the minimum thing you would do for a guest to come to your home. So Jesus then turned to the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? And then Simon's like, yeah, I see her. That's kind of the problem. We were having a good time. Yeah, I see her. But then Jesus says, I came into your house. You didn't give me any water for my feet. But she wiped my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't give me a kiss. But this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You didn't put oil on my head, but you poured perfume on my feet. Simon, you couldn't even do the minimum that you would do for polite company. Because Simon didn't feel like he owed Jesus anything. Simon felt like he had it all covered on his own. He didn't need anything that Jesus had to offer. And then Jesus makes it very clear about the fact of what her actions show. Jesus goes on to say, therefore I tell you, her many, many sins have been forgiven. Yes, you're right. She did lead a sinful life. And you know what? It's forgiven. And she understands that because her great love shows that. She poured out everything she had in appreciation and love of Jesus. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. She understands she's been forgiven for so much. You don't think you've been forgiven for much. With anything. And your actions make that clear. And the thing that Jesus then drives home is this idea that he turns to the woman and says, your sins are forgiven. Right now, Solomon has not led a sin-free life despite what he thinks of himself. Right? We know that the Pharisees were hugely problematic. Right? We know that Pharisees didn't care about people. I mean, they did all the religious stuff. They went to church every week, sort of thing. Right? And they fasted and they tithed. They did all the things they were supposed to do from a religious standpoint, but how did they treat people? We know they didn't care about people. They pursued power over people. They pursued money over people. They pursued prestige. Right? And recognition. We know that because it's this whole idea, right? The idea that you have this dinner and invite people to come in to see how smart you are. Right? That they may think they have it all covered because of their religious activity or their good living, but the reality is we all have versions of those things. And when we recognize that we all have this opportunity to step in and be part of that and to receive it, not try to earn it, that we're free from trying to earn it. We ask for it and we accept it. And something that I find so amazing, that the group of people that Jesus is sitting at dinner with, the ones who have the learned and the smart and the ones who know everything, and compare themselves to this woman, who they think came through the door for their leftovers. She's the one who knew what Jesus was. In fact, it says the other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Like, who is this guy? Who does he think he is? See, the thing that I look at here is that they thought this woman was coming in for their leftovers. Well, she was the only one who knew, this is corny, she was the only one who knew what the main course actually was. Right? The one that was there of value and purpose and meaning and life transformation. You guys came here to show off and eat a big meal. And she came forward with humility and a hunger to express her love for what she had been given. And just to close it out, to make it very clear that none of her actions are why she is forgiven, the last thing Jesus says in this narrative is, Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So friends, that is the invitation, to recognize that we cannot do it on our own. There is no good enough. There is not a punch ticket to heaven. It's an expression of faith in Jesus Christ, that through his work, through his death and resurrection, forgiveness is available. We ask for it, we receive it, and through the power and freedom that we find through that forgiveness, we then go out and do the things that do change the world, that do lift lives up, that do make a difference. But those things are the response to the gift, not the purchase price.